The house that Audrey, Charlie, and I live in belonged to my grandparents for many years. When we moved in, a number of family items came with the house. One of them was this little cross. It was stuck on a cupboard in the kitchen, and etched on it is a verse from our lectionary text, one that has a greatest hits of Sunday school feel to it. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Now, its style of piety isn't quite ours, but we've left it there to remember my grandparents. I suspect it escaped the otherwise thorough cleaning of the house before we moved in, but I can't help but escape the thought that maybe it was left there on purpose to encourage Audrey and me, clearly known for our heathenly ways, to be good. I don't know. Whatever the case, when I saw it, I thought of our lectionary text this morning. This morning, I'd like to explore the topic of the Bible and trauma in relation to our text from Joshua. As I begin, I invite you to take about 30 seconds to reflect on what you think about when you hear the Bible and trauma. I won't ask you to share your thoughts, I promise, but consider jotting down what comes to mind. What do you think about when you hear the Bible and trauma? Are they related? If so, how? I'll pause about 30 seconds. One of the things I think about is the Bible as a source of trauma. I think about a book like Joshua. It tells of Joshua leading the Israelites into a land that belonged to other people, the Canaanites, or the Amorites, as our text called them. The Israelites then kill or displace many of the indigenous people from their lands. These themes have disturbing parallels to how other colonizing groups have treated indigenous peoples and their lands. Indeed, the book of Joshua has even been used to try to legitimate such efforts that groups like the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery now work to undo. When I think about the Bible as a source of trauma, I also think of our standout memory verse from Joshua. I suspect it's not hard to imagine this verse in the mouth of a parent. As for me and my household, which includes you, we, including you, are going to serve the Lord, even if you don't want to. And in the process, the piety of the parent ends up imposed on the child, who might well have had other ideas about whether they wanted to dance or play cards, or so I hear from many of you about growing up. Now, even if an example like this might not lead to trauma in a clinical sense, it could certainly do harm. In the remainder of this sermon, I want to head in a slightly different direction, to explore the book of Joshua as a product of trauma. In so doing, I don't intend to minimize experiences where the Bible has been a source of trauma, but I'd like to invite us to think in an additional way about the topic. So let's explore why we might think about at least parts of the Bible as products of trauma and what might come. Biblical scholars think that the book of Joshua is part of a much larger story. It spans several biblical books, beginning in Deuteronomy, extending into Joshua, and continuing all the way through Judges, Samuel, and Kings. The story, we think, came together near the time of the exile, a period of time after the Babylonian Empire besieged and conquered Jerusalem. When they did, they forcibly displaced numerous Judeans away from the land that they had called home. So between the horrors of ancient siege warfare and forced displacement, This was a traumatic time for many ancient Judeans, and as part of the larger story that emerged against this backdrop, we can think about the book of Joshua as a product of trauma. But it's not just that the narrative took shape amidst traumatic times. David Jansen, no idea if he's Mennonite, is a biblical scholar who studies trauma in biblical texts. He draws on studies of literature from communities who have experienced trauma and identifies some common features of this type of literature. One is that such literature usually tries to offer some sort of ethical explanation of the suffering, to make some sort of moral sense of what happened. And the larger story within which our text is set does precisely this. It attributes the suffering of the exile to God punishing Israel for their sin. In this framing, Israel was presented with a choice going all the way back to Moses. And then, despite repeated warnings from prophets who encouraged the people to return to a God who would forgive them, they made the wrong choice. And God eventually punished them. So goes the dominant explanation of the exile in the larger story. And yet another feature of trauma literature is that other bits often intrude. They question, they subvert, they challenge the dominant explanation. And I think we can see that in our lectionary text, which has the feeling of a bit of a ritual ceremony. Think of a wedding, the part when a minister asks, "Do you take so-and-so as your lawfully wedded?" And the person says, "I do," and then the other person is asked the same. And then there's rejoicing as the couple is pronounced married, as wives, as husbands, or as husband and wife. And our text has a little bit of that feel to it as well. Joshua assembles the people and then reminds what God has previously done for Israel. He then exhorts them to revere and serve the Lord, and in response they say, "We will serve the Lord." And that's precisely where things get a little strange. Joshua says, "You cannot serve the Lord." But wasn't that exactly what Joshua told them to do? Why command them to serve the Lord if they can't even do it? If we go back to our moment in the wedding ceremony when a member of the wedding party asks, "Do you?" and they say, "I do," imagine a shocking twist. The officiant says, "You cannot." It feels a bit like that in the text. And I think it gets more strange as we continue. Joshua begins to explain, "For he is a holy God and a jealous one," which may be familiar enough. But then Joshua says, "God will not forgive your transgressions." Wait, what? He will not forgive your transgressions. I can imagine the people protesting here, but wait, what about that good old-time religion stuff we heard from our ancestors? The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation and forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, to quote Exodus, Joshua. What do you mean, Joshua, that he won't forgive our transgressions? So part of our lectionary text, I think, moves in some rather curious directions. Rather than suggest the Israelites suffered because they had a choice and made the wrong one, here the suffering might be attributed to an unforgiving and more than a bit unreasonable God. This calls into question the dominant ethical explanation of the exile, something Jansen might identify as one of the marks of trauma on literature. If that's right, our text might well attest to trauma in some of its very content. So what comes of thinking about parts of the Bible, at least, as emerging from or being impacted by trauma? I confess here that I don't have all the implications worked out. But one of the things I have valued about Anabaptist circles like ours is an emphasis on wrestling with texts together, which makes something like preaching with somebody talking longer than they should about a biblical text a bit odd. Sorry. I hope this sparks conversation then, a dialogue about the Bible and trauma that we can pick up in sermon talk, or maybe later in the week over coffee or amber-hued beverages, as you like. One thing I'm struck by is the way that our text gives voice to some rather shocking speech about God. Leaving aside a desire to judge this theology as right or wrong, I think it's surprising to read a text describing God as unwilling to forgive people who are unable to do the right thing. I think what our text is doing is giving voice to what some from ancient Israel or Judah felt amidst the trauma of their time. Rather than suppress or dismiss these ideas, the text voices them. Perhaps we too may find here encouragement to lean into giving voice to our own experiences without forcing them to conform to our own accepted scripts. And may we likewise find people courageous enough to listen to and journey with us. Perhaps becoming aware of trauma's impact on the Bible might also encourage us to attend to the trauma around and within us. In preparing for this sermon, I stumbled upon a recent article from the American Psychological Association. It suggests that in the supposed aftermath of the COVID pandemic, and here I quote, a superficial characterization of day-to-day life being more normal is obscuring the post-traumatic effects that have altered our mental and physical health. In other words, at least as I read them, they suggest that what we experienced in the pandemic, things like substantial uncertainty, isolation, the death of friends and loved ones, they can continue to harm and have effects even as things may appear to be back to normal. Effects can include, they say, things like challenges to our physical and mental health, like depression, anxiety, or a lowered immune system. The article goes on to point to other contributing factors to this post-traumatic situation they identify, like global conflicts, racism, and climate disasters. Perhaps in becoming aware of the trauma within the Bible, we might be encouraged to become aware of it in our own lives and in the lives of those around us. And in becoming aware, may God strengthen us to respond. And may we find this community a source of support in our journeys. So the Bible and trauma, what comes to mind? The Bible as a source of trauma? The Bible as a product of trauma? Something else entirely. I look forward to conversation. Amen.